On November 9, 2025, Mmtlp community member Nicholas Raya made the following post on the X platform.
When reviewing FOIAs today, I noticed December 5, 2022, when Sam Draddy reached out to the SEC, I had an email showing Gensler and his team examining OCR SOS numbers. The acronym represents Optical Character Recognition of Secretary of State numbers. The significance here, these numbers serve as identifiers for corporations and LLCs used by the SEC in fraud detection to trace ownership chains, for example, parent, subsidiary, offshore entity. Also included in the mix is Jessica Wachter, who served as chief economist and director of the Division of Economic Risk and Analysis. Could this be a connection exposing Gary's team actively working with Sam Draddy?
He then included the December 5, 2022 email from FINRA's Sam Draddy, communicating with redacted contacts at the SEC regarding the suspicion of fraud/manipulation in Mmtlp and MMAT, conducting a blue sheet investigation into both tickers, and requesting to coordinate investigations with the SEC to prevent duplicating efforts. He also included the OCR SOS numbers emails, which are entirely redacted aside from the subject, time, and participants included. The following video is an AI analysis of the participants based on their roles, and in context to the timing of the conversations that took place on December 5, 2022. Then after that, I provide my own added commentary and opinions based on information that the community has known for quite some time. First, the setup. On the morning of December 5th, Sam Draddy from FINRA's fraud team contacts the SEC. The subject, an inquiry into MMAT and MMTLP. The key line? They needed to coordinate with the SEC to avoid duplicating efforts, and are looking at both issuers from a fraud/manipulation angle. This coordination request, likely involving a deep dive into electronic blue sheet data, is the catalyst. Blue sheets, remember, are the granular trading records, an essential investigative source used by regulators to confirm and prove market manipulation schemes, including abusive short selling. Scene 2. The SEC's instant response. Within hours, the SEC appears to respond, but not with a simple reply. They launch an internal discussion with the subject, OCR SOS numbers. In my opinion, and based on the date and time, this email subject points to the efforts the SEC began to undertake when they became aware of the situation. These appear to have been the efforts that Draddy was trying to not duplicate. The subject likely refers to the SEC's process for identifying the legal corporate entity involved in the trading, which is a necessary preliminary step to using blue sheet or CAT data. OCR SOS numbers is a process for converting physical or static corporate documents into searchable, machine-readable data, with the goal of correctly identifying the legal entity, meaning the parent company, LLC, or subsidiary, using its official state registration number. This step is essential in a fraud investigation because you must first confirm the legal name and identity of the corporation, fund, or entity before you can successfully query its trading activity. And this is where it gets explosive. Look at the recipients in the email chain. This isn't just a single department. The individuals included in the redacted OCR SOS numbers emails represent a highly unusual concentration of senior leadership from the SEC's most critical divisions for market surveillance, data analysis, and policy formulation. Their joint involvement strongly indicates that the subject matter was of immediate, high-level, and multidisciplinary importance to the Commission, far exceeding that of a routine inquiry. Here is a detailed account of what their involvement most likely indicates, based on their roles. Division of Trading and Markets, the Market Structure Experts. Hao Xiangjia Director, Division of Trading and Markets, Direct Oversight and Interpretation. As the head of the division that regulates broker-dealers, exchanges, and FINRA, his involvement signals that the issue concerns market structure, rules, and surveillance systems like blue sheets and/or CAT data. He would be responsible for assessing if the market rules themselves were violated or were in need of adjustment. David Saltiel, Deputy Director of Trading and Markets, Acting Director of the Division of Analytics and Research. His role bridged trading and markets and data analysis. This indicates there was a need to translate trading data into findings that trading and markets could use for rule-based action, for example, regulation SHO violations and other types of market manipulation. Andrea Orr, Associate Director, Division of Trading and Markets, Legal Review and Rulemaking. Oversees the review of legal and administrative aspects of significant trading and markets matters, including rulemakings and SRO, FINRA, reviews. Her presence suggests the findings were being immediately assessed for potential legal action or rule changes. Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, DERA, the data scientists, Jessica Wachter, Chief Economist and Director, Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, DERA, Quantitative Integrity and Economic Impact. DERA provides rigorous economic analysis and data analytics for enforcement. Her involvement confirms the OCR-SOS numbers conversation likely led to complex quantitative data being analyzed to identify evidence of fraud/liability, estimate ill-gotten gains, and assess the broader market risk/impact. Office of the Chair, Policy and Strategy. Rao Trading and Markets Counsel/Senior Advisor to the Chief Data Officer, Strategic Coordination and Policy Alignment. As a key advisor in the Chair's office, he provides the link between technical data and the Chair's strategic, regulatory, and enforcement agenda. His involvement would have ensured the investigation was aligned with Chair Gensler's priorities and leveraged data analytics to their fullest extent. Heather Slavkin-Corzo, Regulatory and Public Policy Expert, Senior Policy Director, Political/Policy Guidance and External Messaging. Her role focused on policy advocacy and working with external stakeholders. Her presence suggests a need to assess the issue's potential political sensitivity, industry response, and public communication strategy given the severity of a potential market manipulation finding. Liz Bloom, Speechwriter to the Chair. Chair Gensler's direct communication. This is a highly unusual inclusion for a technical data analysis email. It is the strongest indicator that the OCR-SOS numbers were expected to yield findings that would necessitate a direct public statement or congressional testimony from the chair himself. Assessment of coordinated high-level involvement. The simultaneous inclusion of these specific high-ranking staff members in the OCR-SOS numbers discussion, occurring on the same day as FINRA's coordination request, leads to the following assessment. 1. FINRA's trigger. Sam Draddy's email from FINRA explicitly calls out Mmtlp and the suspicion of fraud/manipulation involving blue sheet data and seeking to coordinate with the SEC to avoid duplicating efforts. This elevated the issue from a standard examination to a high-priority interagency enforcement/surveillance matter. 2. The SEC's response. Within hours of the FINRA email, the SEC's top staff across 3 key groups mobilize: the market regulators, trading, and markets, to understand the trade mechanics and potential rule violations. The data scientists, DERA, presumably to crunch the data and provide the necessary statistical evidence of fraud. The policy/strategy team, Office of the Chair, to guide the investigation and prepare the chairman for the inevitable political, policy, and public fallout of a major market manipulation finding. 3. The appearance of urgency and coordination. The combined recipients, the head of trading and markets, the chief economist, the chief data strategist, and the chair's speechwriter, suggest the data analysis was viewed as the critical, immediate obstacle to be overcome before making a major decision. It signifies that the SEC was not just opening an inquiry, but was moving directly to validate the quantitative evidence for a highly sensitive and potentially significant enforcement action or major rule change announcement. The level of involvement points to an issue being escalated directly to the commission-level agenda and not handled solely by the Division of Enforcement. The involvement of the speechwriter and policy director indicates the staff understood the final analysis would likely result in a public regulatory or political event. In a nutshell, for these individuals to be in the same email chain with a subject centered on the analysis of trading data on the same date just hours after FINRA alerted the SEC to their investigation into Mmtlp and MMAT trading data concerning fraud/manipulation. It's difficult not to draw the conclusion that these conversations are related, and that whatever the SEC discovered, they needed all hands on deck to prepare for what was likely to follow. Why this is a smoking gun is because the SEC clearly found something, and seemingly were preparing to address it. But if what they found pointed to fraud/manipulation on the part of the issuers, wouldn't they have stepped in to prevent the Mmtlp corporate action from being published the very next day? It would have been their obligation, in addition to possibly halting trading in MMAT as well. By doing nothing, the SEC would possibly be considered guilty of aiding and abetting. But we know that the data they were analyzing didn't point to the issuers. How do we know this? Because a year and a half later, the SEC did file charges against John Burda, George Palikaris, and Metamaterials. But the charges were based on what the SEC calls a scheme relating to the reverse merger, long before and unrelated to the discussions that took place on December 5, 2022.
Here's a direct quote from the SEC's complaint. Torchlight's stock price artificially increased as a result of defendant's scheme. However, the evidence available at this time is inconclusive as to whether, or to what extent, the trading volume was attributable to short sellers covering their positions versus defrauded investors purchasing Torchlight stock to burn the shorts or obtain the preferred dividend that they believed was worth $1 to $20.
The SEC makes it clear, a year and a half after the December 5th email thread, that the evidence they have is inconclusive in reference to trading data. But when you observe the participants in the December 5th email, it very clearly points to a discovery relating to market manipulation. The inconclusive nature of the SEC's complaint, very closely linked to MMAT and MMTLP, which FINRA was actively blue-sheeting for fraud/manipulation, further compounds the ambiguity and supports the argument that the core market integrity issue, what the December 5th groups likely were mobilized to investigate, was either ignored or deliberately avoided. Because, as we know, the Mmtlp corporate action was published the next day on December 6th, and nearly 3 years later, there still hasn't been an enforcement action based on actual data. On the contrary, FINRA and the SEC are fighting extremely hard to keep the data hidden, while John Burda and George Palikaris welcome the opportunity to have a public congressional hearing, or to present their case and defend themselves in a court of law. But there's another aspect to this case that further reinforces the idea that the data is less than likely to reveal foul play on behalf of the issuers. On December 14, 2022, the SEC charged 8 social media influencers in a $100 million stock manipulation scheme. According to the SEC's case, this group, known as the Atlas 8, influenced their combined millions of followers, informing them of certain stock developments that might have encouraged investors to buy and to expect price targets to be reached in a multitude of securities. However, according to the data obtained by the SEC allegedly has proof that the Atlas Group was selling earlier than they led their followers to believe. How this relates to MMTLP is that Torchlight, TRCH, was one of the stocks allegedly promoted by the Atlas 8. According to the SEC, the Atlas Group hyped the reverse merger between Torchlight and Metamaterials, promoting the dividend that would later become known as MMTLP, that investors would receive by holding TRCH through the reverse merger, and making claims that Metamaterials might be conducting some sort of business with Tesla. I just so happen to know from this 2023 Amazon AWS presentation that the SEC utilized CAT data to conduct their investigation into the Atlas Group. I also know that the SEC informed John Burda and George Palikaris in July of 2023 via Wells Notice that they were being investigated in relation to the reverse merger, dating back to September 2021. So given that the SEC was already utilizing CAT data to investigate the Atlas 8 and their TRCH trading activity, and since the SEC was investigating John Burda and George Palikaris as early as September 2021, it isn't a stretch to draw the conclusion that the SEC has been watching the trading activity of Burda and Palikaris since that time. This brings us all the way back to 2024 when the SEC finally filed their charges against Burda, Palikaris, and Metamaterials. The SEC alleges that the reverse merger was a scheme to punish short sellers, even though this alleged scheme was reviewed and made effective by the SEC. And as I've already mentioned, the SEC hasn't been able to produce data to support their accusations. So on December 5, 2022, when the SEC was discussing OCR SOS numbers and seemingly preparing to disclose their findings in some capacity, they clearly didn't have anything in their data that would have helped to prove fraud or manipulation on behalf of John Burda or George Palikaris. They didn't have anything after already investigating since September 2021, and they still didn't have anything nearly 3 years later when they filed their charges. So by the process of elimination, whatever fraud and/or manipulation that alerted FINRA, which most likely prompted the SEC to get involved in the way they did, obviously didn't come from the actions of John Burda or George Palikaris. What does this tell you? From my perspective, and from the perspective of many others including the courts, the SEC's pursuit is novel in nature and has already been struck down when broker-dealers presented a similar case when they were seemingly caught manipulating overstock. The irony here is that now the SEC appears to be doing the dirty work of the broker-dealers by presenting a very similar case that would only distract from and protect the parties that the data most likely reveals to be the perpetrators. The fact that the SEC filed charges against the Atlas Group first, specifically on December 14, 2022, the date that the Mmtlp Next Bridge Hydrocarbons 1-for-1 exchange was supposed to occur, along with the Mmtlp shares being cancelled, causes me to believe that the SEC believed that the Atlas Group's influence was the main contributing factor to investors in TRCH holding through the reverse merger, therefore becoming the Mmtlp investors that FINRA and the SEC have done nothing to protect. The SEC continues to pursue their case against the Atlas Group, which reinforces the idea that it's the SEC's belief that their influence had an impact on the market. It also doesn't help the Atlas Group that they've been so defiant, but it's in my opinion that the SEC's rightful disdain for their social media antics has had an influence on the way the SEC has treated all investors in Mmtlp. I have no doubt that there are Mmtlp investors and MMAT investors that either got into the securities or continued to hold the securities based on something they heard from the Atlas Group, but it's impossible to ascertain how many investors were influenced by them or any other social media influencer, CEO, friend, family member, co-worker, or even publicly filed documents that an investor used to make their own decision. So with this in mind, let's just take a moment to think about what followed. Contrary to FINRA's Rule 6490, which basically stipulates that both investigations from FINRA and the SEC were reason enough in themselves not to process the Mmtlp corporate action, FINRA did proceed with processing the Mmtlp corporate action, but they overstepped their authority by dictating to Metamaterials how the corporate action would be worded and which dates would be included. And when you take a look at this email obtained from another granted FOIA request, you'll notice that the SEC was in contact with FINRA's OTC Corporate Actions Department concerning the Mmtlp corporate action on or before December 2, 2022, at least 4 days before the initial corporate action was published. Let's use our heads here. We can't see the names of who FINRA was communicating with, but the content of the email indicates that FINRA and the SEC were alerted by fraud tips sent to both entities, which seemingly brought attention to a corporate action that was yet to be published. Then, when the corporate action gets published, it's only after FINRA has done something they weren't supposed to do, which was to force the issuer to accept the changes they made, essentially allowing a deficient corporate action to be published. Then, the DTCC requested to meet with the counsels of the issuers and FINRA, but FINRA ghosted the meeting. But shortly afterwards, FINRA met with the DTCC alone via a call. Seemingly as a result of this meeting, FINRA once again revised the Mmtlp corporate action, further removing key information, which essentially altered the corporate action from a 1-for-1 exchange on December 14th after the close of business, to a symbol deletion corporate action that took place 40 hours before the planned 1-for-1 exchange. These changes, combined with the removal of CNS settlement after the December 7th trading day and FINRA's U3 halt before the start of the December 9th trading day, complicated the process for tracking failures to deliver, preventing the reconciliation of short-selling obligations, which more than likely would have resulted in a massive short squeeze in Mmtlp. And this isn't just an assumption. TradeStation has admitted that they weren't allocated enough shares of NextBridge hydrocarbons to facilitate all transfer requests from former holders of Mmtlp. Several Mmtlp community members from E-Trade have shared screenshots of their good-till-canceled Mmtlp sell orders being flagged as too late to cancel and attempting to execute for upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars per share. FINRA has produced 2 FAQs relating to the Mmtlp corporate actions and trading halt, but they include lies that FINRA created the corporate actions consistent with the information provided by the issuer, and the estimate that they provided concerning short interest in Mmtlp at the time of the halt falls significantly below what NextBridge Hydrocarbons has been approached for from certain parties seeking to close out their short-selling obligations. After thousands of complaints to FINRA and to the SEC, congressional outreach and social media outcry, the SEC has yet to formally address the matter after nearly 3 years. But when you look at the participants in this December 5th email conversation, along with the subject matter and the timing of the conversation, it becomes clearer and clearer that the SEC was fully aware of the situation and appears to have had a hand in how it played out. Further evidence of this can be found in the video, Mmtlp 12-12-22, which can be found on YouTube. What's especially interesting is that David Saltiel, the SEC's then Deputy Director of Trading and Markets, was both present in the December 5th email conversation and in the December 12th meeting, which was clearly a meeting about Mmtlp. Let me take a crack at what I believe occurred. Just my opinion, of course. The fact that Draddy's December 5, 2022 email was a follow-up to a November 29, 2021 email with the same inquiry subject, combined with the way he begins the email, redacted, looks like this MMAT/MMTLP matter has now hit my fraud team's radar screen, and seemingly a lot of other radar screens as well, suggests a long-standing issue. Draddy was obviously in the know, even before his fraud team that was now CC'd in the same inquiry email thread. Because on December 2, 2022, FINRA's fraud team sent this message detailing tips sent to FINRA and the SEC related to Mmtlp, as well as being aware that the SEC was reaching out to FINRA's OTC corporate actions team concerning the Mmtlp corporate action. The reference to other radar screens can easily be translated to new individuals or groups learning about the MMAT/MMTLP matter. So when you think of the participants in the OCR SOS numbers email thread, you get the impression that most, if not all, of those participants were reacting to information that was new to them, which makes it obvious that just like Draddy at FINRA, there were people at the SEC that knew there was a problem but kept it from others. The same way that Draddy appeared to have kept it from his own fraud team. The year gap in between Draddy's inquiry emails and the request to meet with the SEC to prevent duplicating efforts just further gives the impression that Draddy wasn't fully in the loop. On December 5, 2022, Sam Draddy and his fraud team formally initiated a blue sheet investigation into Mmtlp, but the counsels of Metamaterials and NextBridge Hydrocarbons were also in touch with FINRA's executive team on that same day, questioning the delay in processing the Mmtlp corporate action. There's zero chance that Robert W. Cook wasn't aware of Draddy seeking to coordinate investigations with the SEC, which, according to these emails, continued that same day. So on one side, Cook and FINRA's executive team were clearly aware that the issuers were concerned about the delay in processing the Mmtlp corporate action. But they also had to know that Draddy and the SEC were actively investigating these same issuers. Both of these investigations, according to FINRA's Rule 6490, were reason enough to not proceed with processing the Mmtlp corporate action submission. But the first corporate action was published the following day, on December 6, 2022. Robert W. Cook demonstrated his knowledge of FINRA's Rule 6490 in his reply to Rep. Ralph Norman and the over 70 members of Congress, but he conveniently left out the aspects concerning deficiency determinations and the question of how, if it was FINRA's priority to protect investors, why would they be so quick to publish the corporate action when there was a suspicion of fraud and/or manipulation? No matter how FINRA chooses to explain this, there will always be a contradiction. In multiple lawsuits related to Mmtlp since the U3 halt, FINRA has repeatedly claimed that blue sheeting is burdensome and time-consuming, but we're supposed to believe that FINRA initiated blue sheet investigations into both MMAT and Mmtlp on December 5, 2022, and somehow completed the process in less than a day, ruling out fraud and/or manipulation that could have caused harm to investors. Then, after Mmtlp was U3 halted and deleted, MMAT continued to trade. So if the regulators believed it was the issuers that committed some sort of fraud or manipulation, it appears that they chose to punish the issuers and the investors that they also seem to believe were only holding these securities because they were influenced by the Atlas 8 group, and an obscure Italian interview excerpt that was taken out of context. The regulators then punished the issuers and the investors by allowing FTDs to go unaddressed, as well as other market manipulation that favored those that decided to short these securities, and hijacking the Mmtlp corporate action to ensure they embedded an excuse to initiate the U3 halt. So some questions need to be answered. What was the SEC discussing in its December 5, 2022 OCR SOS numbers email thread? What did the SEC later discuss with FINRA's Sam Draddy and his fraud team concerning Mmtlp and MMAT? Why did the DTCC request to meet with the issuers of Mmtlp and FINRA? When the DTCC had a meeting with FINRA without the issuers, what did they discuss? And before all of this, who was it from the SEC that reached out to FINRA's OTC Corporate Actions team on or before December 2nd to discuss the Mmtlp corporate action? What did they talk about? The SEC was clearly involved before the Mmtlp corporate actions, and as you'll see from the 12/12/22 video, directly after the U3 halt, but for some odd reason Gary Gensler would have us believe that FINRA didn't consult the SEC regarding their decision to halt trading. If this is true, Gensler conveniently left out what FINRA clearly did consult the SEC about on December 2nd, December 5th, December 11th, and December 12th at the very least. And when you have a clear recognition of the SEC's involvement, it makes it easier to understand why the SEC hasn't lifted a finger in terms of addressing FINRA's failures to adhere to their rules when exceeding beyond their role to merely review and process the corporate action submission. From my perspective, the SEC can't address FINRA's rule violations because FINRA was likely acting on guidance they received from the SEC and the DTCC. In my opinion. But let's do away with opinions and just be transparent. Let's see the unredacted emails, and let us know the true share count. Hiding this information only makes the regulators appear to be guilty of defrauding the investors they claim to protect. This concludes the presentation.